to do something which I believe is impossible, to summarize in 3 minutes the point that they'd like to make. And of course, nobody can do this. Raleigh Comstock was just saying to me that he's never summarized anything in less than 15 minutes. I'm sure that similar statements could be made about all of us. I'd like to introduce these gentlemen then to you and ask them for a brief comment relative to what they've been speaking to on this day. The first is Chairman of the Department of Ecology at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Alan Brook, who addressed himself to the question of the impact of man on non-human forms of life. He was recently quoted in the newspaper as expressing his concern for man in his environment, saying that what we really need is a new religious movement. I don't know if he used the term, but something like an ecological Billy Graham. I present to you Dr. Alan Brook.
Well, I think this is exactly what I did say. I think I did say we wanted an ecological Billy Graham. I'm glad we've been told that what we're about to do is impossible, because I think it is impossible to really get the gist of what went on in the discussion this morning in 3 minutes. What I will say is that really I didn't talk about what I was supposed to talk about, which was man's impact on non-human forms of life, which is a very bad way to start. I was heartened, you see, by the fact that Mr. McHarg, and I kept calling him Dr. McHarg, and he corrected me. He was very pleased that he wasn't a PhD or a DSc, and that he was just plain Mr. But he said at one point in his very interesting discourse, ecology, ecology, more ecology. And this is where I took off, and I tried to outline to the group what was meant and what we were trying to do in the Department of Ecology. And the point that I think I tried to make was that our aim in the Department of Ecology at the university, which is the first department of its kind in the United States and possibly anywhere in the world, is to educate everybody who goes through the university, make ecology a part of the thinking and the education experience of every educated man. So this is one of the points that I hope I got home. The crisis that we face is not what man has done in the past. I think if things just stayed as they were now, we'd probably get along. It's what he is doing now and what he will do in the future, I think, that is the real crisis. We've got to look ahead before we're engulfed in a sea of concrete or oil or plastic or smog. And before we lose many of the qualities of life that we hold dear to us now. It's a terrible thing to come to a symposium and take to task the very title of the symposium. And I remember when the brochure came across my desk at the university, I drew a large red ring round the title, which is Man and His Earth. And of course, I think one of the messages that got across today is that it is not his earth. It is certainly, we live here and we exist here, but it is not our earth exclusively. And I apologize for criticizing the title of the symposium, but I think the very fact that it has the title Man and His Earth is important, because it makes us really think, well, is it really our earth? The real crisis, and I think the point I tried to bring across was that the real crisis is the exponential growth of population. It's a population crisis and the exponential growth of industry. The economists tell us that to have a healthy economy, we must expand industry at a rate of 5% per annum, or even better, 10%. But 5% is a sort of working figure, and we can't go on at this sort of rate. And one of the things I urged was that we must, as ecologists, get together with economists, and we are really ecologists are a group of people who look at the structure and functioning of ecosystems, just as economists look at the structure and functioning of our finances. And as I think one of the points I tried to make was that we're very much in the red in terms of the economy of natural systems is concerned, and we're going deeper and deeper into the red, and we really must do something about it. I also drew on various newspaper clippings. As I pointed out to the group I was talking to, I'm an inordinate newspaper snipper. And one of the things that I commented on was a newspaper clipping by Paul Ehrlich from Stanford, and he had pointed out what we must do to end the ecological crisis. And the first thing is to concern ourselves with the population crisis. First of all, to establish a federal population commission which disseminates propaganda to encourage reproductive responsibility. The second point, which is a rather staggering one, is to change our tax laws, to tax people who have too many children, discourage rather than encourage reproduction. We're being told that we ought to have family allowances. I come from a country, Mr. McCarg talked about, in rather unpraiseworthy terms, about England, and I come from England, although I have lived a lot of my life in Scotland. But in England, in Great Britain, we have family allowances, and this is only adding to the population crisis. The third point is we must have instruction in birth control, and at the same time, something which is very current, we must all concern ourselves with abortion laws. We must reevaluate our views towards abortion. And the fourth thing, which doesn't go down very well with the medical profession, is that we must alter our patterns of biomedical support. The majority of medical support should go into population regulation. It should also go into studies of the environment and also into studies of animal and human behavior, rather than into the short-sighted programs of what Paul Ehrlich calls death control. And one of the points that I made was fine and very marvelous that Dr. Bernard and Dr. Lillihei can transplant hearts and livers and kidneys and so on. But this is bad ecology. It is merely enabling people to live longer and so adding to the ecological crisis. We've got to look at these things. I also quoted another newspaper clipping from a thing that came out of the Minneapolis Tribune only on Monday, a quotation from the Reverend Robert Esbjersen, who talked at the Gustavus Adolphus Layman's Conference on the Misuse of Power. One of the things he said was that he takes the church to task not so much for the misuse of power, but for the non-use of power. And the figures and statistics that he quoted were congregations of 32 millions giving each week 90 millions in subscriptions to the church, with facilities worth $80 billion. And he considers this a very important latent source of power. And what he says, and this is my final comment, and I merely repeat what Mr. Esbjersen has said, that possibly the church should take the lead. And I've said this before, the church should take the lead in the ecological crisis. And he exhorted his congregation by saying, "O Hebrews, you modern Hebrews, to survive is not enough." And we can survive, of course, probably by increased technology. To go along with the system is not enough. If you only survive, you will only die. Moses invited the ancient Hebrews to participate in changing a system, a change inspired by a vision of the holy city, a temple to the honor and glory of God. And there is a change called for now, without which people will perish. The insane sickness of our society is that within 2 or 3 generations we can destroy what it has taken millions of years to build. And we go back to Mr. McHarg's simple algae, the things that I spend all my time studying. But what would happen if 90 million people, and this is no small number, joined together in a common effort to maintain and improve the quality of the environment, a united, organized, disciplined effort? As it is now, we are dissipating our energy in piddling little projects. I hope that we have a Billy Graham amongst us.
Dr. Elving Anderson could not be with us at this session. Is Dr. John Dempsey here? Mr. Louis Crutcher addressed himself to the statement, the question, aesthetics versus prosperity. Mr. Crutcher is Director of Planning and Research for the Minneapolis Park Board. He suggests, or he has suggested, I believe, that every city has its tempo, that Las Vegas or New York or Minneapolis each has its own tempo, and that in our area, the lake and park system sets the tempo of our lives. Mr. Crutcher.
Well, this was true until 35W came through. It's very difficult to summarize a slide presentation in 3 minutes. So what I'd like to do is perhaps summarize my thought, which can best be done by a story. We're talking about cities and ecology. There was a family of New Yorkers, and the oldest and most prosperous son lived in grandeur in a penthouse on Park Avenue. He lived well. He traveled in a rather fast set. And one noon, as he was drinking his coffee in his robe and rummaging through his junk mail, he was rather startled to come across a letter addressed to him in pencil. And as he opened it, he discovered that it was from his country cousin who wanted to come and visit. The most traumatic experience in his whole life had been his visit to the family farm upstate. All those smells and animals and things, but the nice part had been his cousin. They were the same age, they did a little fishing and so forth. Very rough around the edges, but a nice guy. So, blood being thicker than water, he wrote him, come visit and take a certain train, and he'd meet him at Grand Central Station at the time. So, on the appointed day, with some misgivings, he dressed and went down to the station. The train rolled in, and everybody piled out. And there was his cousin. He could see him 2 blocks down the platform, 6'4", straw hat, the old family suitcase with the rope tied around it. So they greeted each other in a rather embarrassed way, and then he had an idea. Instead of just going back to his flat and so forth, he was going to jolt this guy. He was going to give him New York. So they took the tube, and they came up right in the heart of Times Square. Well, there were the towering buildings and thousands of people and the taxicabs darting in through, and sure enough, this poor fellow's mouth fell wide open. And they walked along 2 blocks, and it still hadn't shut. And suddenly, the country boy stopped, and he nudged his city cousin. You hear that? He said, well, hear what? The cricket. Oh, man, you must be kidding. No, there's a cricket. He grabbed his suitcase and he went off through traffic and back into a little side street, back into an alley. And there on a windowsill was a little potted geranium. And on the geranium there was a cricket. Well, this time the city boy's mouth fell open. How'd you hear it? Well, so he reached in his pocket and he pulled out a coin and he dropped it on the sidewalk. Of course, everybody turned around and said, "It's a matter of what you're listening for." Thank you.
Group 5 this afternoon addressed itself to ecology and public education. The discussant in that group was Mr. Richard Meische, director of the Environmental Science Center in Golden Valley. The concern of Mr. Meische, it might be said, is to make ecology as important in public education as English. Mr. Meische.
I want to begin by reciting a parable that I presented to the group that I met with earlier. This parable is taken from the October 1959 issue of the NEA Journal, and I think it will summarize the ecological education crisis that we have today. It goes as follows. "Teacher, what shall we study next? My children are asking, and I glance at the text. Oh, the world outside is aflame today with the colors of autumn, I long to say. As I look askance at the weighty book, let's go sail milkweed pods in the brook. We'll take out the feathery part like lace and send it flying all over the place. We'll find the hill farthest from town, race to the top, and then roll down. Plunge through the beautiful scented grass and count all the butterflies that pass. Go exploring high and windy places, eat wild berries and stain our faces. Let's do all sorts of miraculous things and never come back until the last bell rings. There is more to learn on the hills today than all the books in the world could say. But I curb the impulse and I suppress the yearning and assume the role of dispensing learning. Lessons? Oh yes, they are asking again. Page 6, work the problems from 1 through 10. If we are to bring about environmental sanity, we must, I feel, overhaul our educational practice of dispensing learning. We must teach our children that the world is not a conglomeration of independent things, but rather that the world is made up of a conglomeration of interdependent things. We must stop pigeonholing the information that we teach. Instead, we must clearly understand the interrelationships that exist between all bits of information. When we teach science, we must include and relate to the humanities, sociology, mathematics, and etc. When we teach, we must permit and encourage involvement, discovery, and rediscovery by the child. He must be permitted to get his hands dirty and his feet wet. We must offer him the opportunity to plunge through the beautiful scented grass and count all the butterflies that pass. His experiences must be multisensory. In short, his learning experiences must be fun. He will remember and understand best that he enjoys. Our ecological clock now reads 4 minutes until midnight. What will midnight bring?
Group 6 was led in a discussion by Mr. Raymond Hake. The subject was New Laws to Create a Good Environment. Mr. Hake is a senior partner in the law firm of Popham, Hake, Snowbridge, Kaufman, and Doty in Minneapolis. We might describe him as a conservation activist who is persuaded that municipalities and industries have to be much more aware than they are of the effects of what they do. Society must insist that industry have a long-term, not a short-term outlook. Mr. Haig.
I tried to make 2 points. First was that before we start changing the law, we ought to first try to find out what we've got now on the books, what these laws are designed to accomplish, have they been effective, and why haven't they been effective? And if we want to change the law, what is it that we want to accomplish? Try to develop 2 thoughts. If I quoted, everyone quotes, I quoted Justice Holmes. And he said the law isn't based on logic, and I agree. It's based upon experience. It reflects the social attitudes of people and society. And it's my thesis that the social attitudes of our people in our society is an exploitive society, and we are a very messy group of individuals. I'd like to think that I could agree with Dr. Brooks that we're going to get 90 million united Americans on an ecological kick. I doubt that. And I quoted Marshall McLuhan, who said that the world has become a space capsule, and said that if that's true, it seems rather silly to pin our environmental needs of the future to the robes of a legal system which stresses individual and corporate property rights, the exploitation of our resources, and the conquering of our environment. In a country which has had a great wealth of natural resources, legislation to prevent or control wasteful or unscientific exploitation has never been considered essential. I discussed briefly how we approach the management of our resources, and we approach it now by a compartmentalized approach to our resource management laws. We treat each resource separately. We have special agencies. We even have divisions of divisions. We have clean water agencies, dirty water agencies. Coordination is neither required nor suggested, and each special interest agency offers its own legislative solution to our problems. This ignores the fact of what I've read and listened to today, that we're all part of one unique system. We pay undue deference to the perpetuation of the fragmented powers of states, counties, village, towns, cities, and the endless legal and institutional governmental forms that exist today. Home rule is considered a great and a noble objective. And I closed with one last point that is very close to what I think is an immediate problem, is the failure of our existing public agencies to adequately represent the public interest in making resource decisions. If we can do nothing at all today, we've got to first find out how they arrive at their decision-making process, what considerations they take into effect. And I quoted several court decisions where the courts have been critical of these agencies who wanted to sit back, as one court said, and act as an umpire, blandly calling balls and strikes between 2 unequal protagonists. The right of the public must receive active and affirmative protection at the hands of the public agencies. And we've got to insist that these agencies be adequately staffed and have the competence to make an intelligent resource decision. As it is now, we let the particular resource user proceed with what he desires to do, and then we think we're going to stop a power plant after they've invested $80 million at Monticello or wherever it might be. And I gave some specific examples of that. If we do nothing else but change the law to require any resource user to be compelled before he undertakes any construction to obtain all the necessary resource use permits prior to undertaking construction, we will do more to arrive at a more intelligent use of our resource.
Donald Brower. Is Mr. Brower here? Mr. Brower addressed himself to the topic of planning with nature as a model. It's been his insistence on other occasions that nature is not simply to be manipulated, it needs to speak back to us. We ought to listen, not only to announce. But he's not here, so we won't call on him wherever he is. Group 8, Mr. Roland Comstock of Northern States Power addressed himself to the question of industry's commitment to the land. Mr. Comstock is manager of the Land and Right-of-Way Division of Northern States Power. Aware of the fact that the public utility and other industries are wedded to the land, they do not exist apart from the resources of the land. Mr. Comstock.
I was sure that when I started to listen to, or at least looked at Ray Hake's topic, that he and I would be in unalterable disagreement, which I guess is a common posture for lawyers. But after listening to him, I'm not quite so sure. I tried to make 4 points to our group, and although some of them obviously are going to require some elaboration, or should have elaboration to really present to you, I will try to do so in summary form. First point was a very obvious one, that future demands upon our environment are not going to diminish. Obviously, increasing numbers of people, increasingly clustered in urban centers, will impose greater and greater burdens upon environment, and that fact cannot be avoided. So that our only hope really here is to mitigate the environmental burden, not to eliminate it for a time to come. And under these conditions, the point I was trying to make is that society, that is to say all of us, must carefully understand what conservation means in a specific application. And I feel that at present there is no such general understanding, and that this lack of commonality of definition is a substantial contributor to getting on with the solution to some of the environmental problems. The second point I tried to make was that the problems of environment must be put into some reasonable perspective, a perspective of time and a perspective of solution. I should add for the background information of the audience that my own work with NSP for the last 3 years has required that I had a team of people representing the company before approximately 150 separate units of government, from a federal level down to the most local level, in attempting to develop some kind of acceptable compromise between community need and corporate need and a system expansion. While I tried to, and in some measure unsuccessfully in the discussion period, stay away from a detailed discussion of that experience, necessarily what I'm saying here draws upon this involvement that I have had with many units of government on several levels. And so the second point then is this requirement of perspective of time and perspective of solution. And within my experience during this period, I think I see much aimless thrashing around, too often motivated by lack of understanding or in some cases political necessity. And included in my definition of reasonable perspective was clear identification of problems, problem causers, and perhaps most important of all, the necessity for establishment of priorities of attack. I think it is very obvious that all things cannot be done at once. There must be an allocation of society's resources, the resources of time, the resources of money. The third point that I sought to make was that, by and large, I feel that there has been a rather substantial failure of government on all levels to produce bold and thoughtful solutions to environmental problems. And the reasons for that failure are surely complex, but in part the failure is a product of the proliferation of government, to which Mr. Hake referred, generally in Minnesota, but certainly here in the metropolitan area. In part it is the failure of the general public the environmentalists, and yes, industry too, to permit government to act in a responsible and responsive manner. My last point is, and here I think Mr. Ake and I depart very sharply, and perhaps we should join again in a common forum. It's my firm conviction that solutions to environmental problems cannot come only through the political process. Thoughtful solutions cannot come only through the political process, at least under present conditions. I tried to speak to a future condition which I felt offered substantially more hope for a time to come. Well, having set the stage for what I hoped was a broad framework within which we could talk about industry's commitment to the land, whatever that may mean, I tried to make the point that before there can be commitment to the land by industry, by anyone, or commitment to the water or to the air, there must first occur this perspective of problem, which must be shared by all those who seek to participate in the problem-solving mechanism. I feel very strongly that all of us, and I include industry surely, must stop this search for simplistic labels, good guys versus bad guys, white hats versus black hats. Instead, I feel very strongly that if we are to proceed in a thoughtful, constructive, and timely way in the solution of our environmental problems, which we all share, then we must search for and create meaningful dialogue opportunities, surely in discussions such as these, but also in hearings before regulatory agencies or other units of government, where there must be balance brought, and it can only be brought by a full-scale participation of those who are concerned. And our task under these conditions is clear. The very formidable forces of conservation and of industry must join together to formulate these reasonable criteria. The role of the press in this general atmosphere, in creating an atmosphere within which thoughtful solutions can ensue, is very large. I think that that too can open up a whole subject for further discussion. And we must do all this fairly soon, not next week or next year. And if a consensus is to occur, and I don't think we can develop meaningful solutions without that consensus, then I'm convinced it will be because we have acted collectively in a way that we are not now acting. And if we fail in this task, the answers are still going to be supplied. There's no question about that. They will be supplied legislatively, but we will all lose in some degree the opportunity to share in the formulation of those answers. I think that's kind of a shame. I also think it will stack the cards against meaningful and thoughtful and workable solutions, at least within the near term. Well, when we got all through, I confessed to the group that I really hadn't told them very much about industry's commitment to the land, and that was precisely the point. That no longer are the old criteria in which to judge a commitment, or in which to define the land even. No longer are those criteria valid. They don't exist anymore. They have been abandoned to an extent that I suspect many of us do not yet realize. And the new criteria are yet being shaped. That's part of the function of this gathering. I think under these conditions, any creative effort necessarily is painful and halting. But we have no choice but to join in a common forum to seek a common answer.
Group 9 was led by Mr. Robert Herbst, a new conservation to include man and his future. I'm not sure if Mr. Herbst addressed himself to that. Perhaps he did. He is presently Deputy Commissioner of the Conservation for the state of Minnesota, but he is the elected Executive Director of the National Isaac Walton League, a position which he takes over on the 1st of April of this year. He might be described, and I think rather accurately, as a conservationist, a very professional conservationist who seeks to expand the ordinary notions of conservation. Mr. Herbst.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I feel that conservation in the past has been defined as the wise use of our natural resources, and we have tended to segment each component. But I feel now that the definition is much broader. Conservation should now be defined as the wise use of man's total environment, of which he is an integral part. There are basically two reasons for practicing conservation. The first reason is an obligation to our Maker and to future generations. We have been given the earth and all of its riches. We've been entrusted as wise stewards of these riches. The very first sentence of the Bible tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The second reason for practicing conservation is to provide for our own existence. Man is virtually dependent upon the natural resources of soils, waters, forests, wildlife, and air for his existence and much of his enjoyment. Yet the destruction, as well as the wise use, lies within man's hands. I think that the most ominous of all conservation problems are the statistics relating to world population. Consider for a moment that it took thousands of years to produce the first billion people on this planet. The second billion was reached in 75 years. The third billion was reached in 35 years. We will reach the fourth billion in 7 more years, and we will double today's population by the year 2000. In 22 more years, we will double the world's population, and we will have over 6 billion people. One result of this mushrooming population is the use of urban lands, rural lands, for urban development. I'd like you to think for a moment, looking at your watch, that each minute of the day, and I mean 60 minutes an hour, 24 hours a day, each minute, 5 acres of green America disappears to the urban sprawl. 5 acres of productive forest land, farmland, wildlife habitat areas, and outdoor recreational facilities disappear to highways, factories, residential areas, and the urban sprawl. I feel that accelerated action is needed in all environmental areas. However, it seems to me that there are 4 primary areas that we should concentrate our efforts on. The first is water, the basis of all life. The second is improved wildlife resources. The third is the urban development and its effects on our environment. And I gave several examples here, one being the jet threat at Ham Lake. The fourth area is aesthetics, a beautiful America. We can't make all of America beautiful, it's too big a job. But who wants to be responsible for leaving any part of it ugly? In defining conservation, I referred to the first sentence of the Bible, in the beginning. I'd like to leave with you these thoughts, in the end. There was earth, and it was with form and beauty. And man dwelt upon the lands, the earth, the meadows, and the trees. And he said, let us build our dwellings in this place of beauty. And he built cities, and he covered the earth with concrete and steel. And the meadows were gone. And man said, it is good. On the second day, man looked upon the waters of the earth, and man said, let us put our wastes into the water, that the dirt will be washed away. And man did, and the waters became polluted and foul in their smell. And man said, it is good. On the third day, man looked upon the forests of the earth, and he saw that they were beautiful. And man said, let us cut the timber for our homes, and grind the wood for our use. And man did. And the lands became barren, and the trees were gone. And man said, it is good. On the fourth day, man saw that the animals were in abundance. They ran in the fields, and they played in the sun. And man said, let us cage these animals for our amusement and kill them for our sport. And man did, and there were no more animals on the face of the earth. And man said, it is good. On the fifth day, man breathed the air of the earth, and man said, let us dispose of our wastes in the air so that they may be blown away. And man did, and the air became heavy with dust, and it choked, and it burned. And man said, it is good. On the sixth day, man saw himself, and seeing the many languages and tongues and races, he feared and he hated. And he said, let us build great machines and destroy those lest they destroy us. And man built great machines, and the world was fired with the rages of war. And man said, it is good. On the seventh day, man rested from his labors, and the earth was still, for man no longer dwelt upon this earth, and it was good. Now this thought is written by a high school boy, and it's not the case with our natural resources today. There is much conservation work to be proud of, and many methods of using our resources, such as logging, hunting, and fishing, are actually beneficial when they're properly done. However, there is a familiarity, a ring of truth in what he says. And he again reminds us that individually and collectively, man is responsible for the condition of his own environment. The future of our environment will rest upon the interest of man to provide it and the tools with which he has to do the job. Where do the answers lie? I have said that essentially our problems are people problems. I think the answers lie through a greatly intensified conservation education program. Through education, we can open the doors to information, cooperation, legislation, enforcement, research, decision, funding, qualified conservation personnel, and most important, to public awareness, understanding, and positive action. Albert Schweitzer once said, man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. What do you think? And what are you going to do about it? Thank you.
We pollute the air not only by particles, smoke, but also by sounds. Mrs. Gladys Brooks was here to address herself to the problem of jet noise, but could not be here very long. And Mr. John Richter, a businessman who describes himself as a citizen who gets involved to solve a particular problem at a particular time, also spoke to that problem. Mr. Richter.
The group that was in our meeting were mainly students, and I wanted to show them how to get involved. So I want to get you involved for just a second. I want everyone here who lives in a flight path to raise your hand and keep it up. Anybody live in a flight path of any airport? Have you got any relatives that have homes near airports? And keep your hands up, and those add to it. Any of you taxpayers in the metropolitan area, keep your hands up. This should include everybody here, and this is a very vital problem, and we should all be interested in it. Now, why did I get involved? Because I was told by the Metropolitan Airports Commission that nothing could be done. People said something could be done. So what did we do? We showed the students and the people in the meeting that we rallied the troops. We came out for an ordinance. Why did we have an ordinance in Minneapolis? To change the attitude of the leadership of the airport. That came a year after I met individually with all of the members of the Metropolitan Airports Commission, told them what could be done, gave them 12 months. Nothing was done. Be nice to them, put the screws to them, you get that done. Well, then the next thing we did, we said, all right, now we've got this, let's go a little further. Let's get a noise abatement council that'll keep this thing going. As of Wednesday night, you read it in the Saturday paper, that the first noise abatement council at any airport in the United States that involves citizens 50%, users 50%, will be formed. All right, now in the process of this, we educated a lot of people. As an example, we educated the aldermen before we got the ordinance passed. Then the next thing occurred. My golly, we learned a few things about airports. So you may have read, did any of you read in the paper 2 weeks ago Sunday about a new concept for an airport? Anybody that read it, raise your hand. Okay? Any of you people for it? Sound pretty good? Okay. Now, the reason for this is we looked around and we saw all these problems at Ham Lake. We said we're not going to get involved in Ham Lake. We're just talking about noise. But in the process of going around the world, some of our people have studied noise abatement in Europe. We saw, obviously, how airports are designed. So we picked four airports: Heathrow in London, the new Kansas City Airport in Kansas City, Dulles Airport in Washington, and the Tampa Airport, which will be opened in 1970. And we said, here are some ideas. Let's see if we can use them in Minneapolis. And as I went to Washington and talked to the Department of Transportation about this and engineering firms before we released in the paper, I was kidding them. I said, gee, it looks good for everybody. It looks good for the flyer, the person that flies like myself, the downtown area, the people with the noise problems and everything. I said, there's one problem. It wasn't thought of by the leadership of the Metropolitan Airports Commission. And as of yesterday, I guess I was right. We've got all the people but them. Here's what you people can do if you want to get involved in this. Very simple. Pick up your phone when you get home tonight. Call your state senator, your state representative. Tomorrow, call the governor's office. He's out of town, but call his executive secretary or his secretary. Put your name on the line. Say, please, Mr. Governor, Mr. Levander, please do what you did last fall when the Department of Conservation and the Aeronautics Department were fighting over Ham Lake. I don't like birds to be killed either, and I don't like the water problems to occur, but my main concern right now is noise. Do the same thing you did then. Tell the Metropolitan Council to get involved. Tell them to do like they did in Kansas City. Get a feasibility study, sponsor it, get this to see if this concept you saw in the paper is good. This is how you can help solve the noise problem, not only for we who live in the Twin Cities, but for the entire tax base of our community. Thank you.
It wasn't 3 minutes each, but it was a relatively good try. And yeah, and I'd like to express my appreciation, gentlemen, to this summary of your remarks and for your presence with us. Now, we have with us at this time Mr. Barry Peterson, who's chief of the Physical Development Section of the Metropolitan Council, formerly senior planner of the Minneapolis Planning Department, and he is prepared with a brief presentation. We've asked him to make this presentation for us, a description of what is happening in terms of environment and planning in this area. Mr. Barry Peterson.
In many ways, we're kind of a slave to technology, as this sort of illustrates very graphically. I've been pleased to see the number of people that came out today, concerned enough with this sort of a subject to come out, and many of you have stayed all day. It's been a long day. I'll try not to take a terribly long time, but it will take a little bit of time. I sat in one session this morning and I heard a gentleman say that we didn't have time for goals. I react very badly to that. I think we desperately need goals. We've gone along goalless for so terribly long that it's just unbelievably ridiculous. We don't wait to do things until we have a rigorously defined set of goals for America. We get going now. We do need better education of individuals. We do need a different ethic in America on the relationship of man to his environment. But we can't wait that long. You know, we're talking about 1, 2, 3 generations. We can't do that. What we really need is a vanguard of people who apply political pressure to get laws changed. I think it's really that simple. I've been appalled to go out to hearings of public agencies, like the Pollution Control Agency, when they propose standards for water and for air. And I sit there and I see this weary procession of polluters come and make all these arguments as to why they can't improve their treatment of the environment and their treatment of mankind. But I don't see you. I don't see anybody like you to support these agencies that are supposed to regulate in the public interest. Now, it's inevitable when that kind of thing happens that these people are going to bend in what I think is the wrong way. And they do. And it's our own fault. So what we really need, I guess, crack out of the box, is a group of people that are willing to exert political pressure on politicians to change laws that regulate conduct in the interim before we can change the entire value set of society, I guess. I've worked up, this is my focusing shot, sort of a sunrise, the promise of man, and all that sort of thing. If you're interested, it's Lake Harriet. What I've done is I've put together a set of slides that I think illustrate what is perhaps the most important single point as I see it. The issue really is the continued existence of natural systems in an urban area. And this basically means a watershed. A watershed functions as a system, as a kind of a unit. It's defined in terms of which way drops a waterfall when it rains or when water melts. And what I've done, I started out originally, I was going to pick a stream in the metropolitan area that had been badly treated in the downstream portion, but the upstream part of it was still held promise of remedial kinds of action. The stream is not important, so I'm not even going to tell you the name. The principle is the thing that's important. What I discovered as I went along this stream photographing is that in a sort of a process of incremental destruction, we're eliminating any capacity that this particular stream has to continue to live and function and provide value to the people that live here now and who will live here in the future. It rises from a lake, flows over a control structure, and immediately we start to constrict it. We have people who have seen fit to build a house structure about 18 inches above the water and about 3 feet away from the stream bank. Now this means, and we'll see this over and over again as we go down this particular stream, this means that the minute this stream rises more than about 18 inches, some politician gets a cry for flood control works. Right? Right. This is looking south from where we were just looking. It looks pretty natural, right? This is an area that is working for man probably to a greater degree than any other kind of real estate works. This is a great, fantastic sponge. It's the critical element in the continued life of a stream. It takes in precipitation, it takes in melting snow, rain, just sucks it up and holds it, filters out the debris and the siltation, and gradually releases water so that you have a more or less continued kind of flow in this stream of relatively clear water year-round. Provides wildlife habitat and that sort of thing. Okay, we're going to look around the periphery of this area. It's actually about, let's say 300 acres roughly. And this is the kind of thing that's happening around it. This is a small marsh area on the west side of this lake. It's gone. All we have is a pile of dirt and, well, you can see a few water weeds there at the corner. Now we jump up to the northeast corner, looking back over that vast sponge area. The stream is running right along that tree line there. And the advancing frontier of urbanization is coming along, hastened by this fellow and his bulldozer. You can see a very clear demarcation between this hard cover that we're putting on this area so that it can't absorb precipitation anymore. It can't retain it and allow it to run off gradually. Okay, we not only lose that aspect of it, we pay a premium for building in these kind of areas. All of those pilings cost money. Anyone who's ever tried to build on a swamp knows that it is fairly expensive. It can be done. You can build something any place if you pay enough. Some of us do. Initially and forever. Okay, this is on the south. Here we have some more advancing urban frontier. Southeast, more urban frontier. Pretty scabby looking, actually. This is the outlet. This is the provision for precipitation runoff that has been made. Just a gouged channel. You can, if you know anything about soil, you know that that's tremendously organic material. It's humus. It's going to wash off in the spring. I can go back out there this spring and show you pictures of most of that stuff washed off down that ditch and into the stream. Where does it go? It goes to greet the people on down farther. Oh, this is just a kind of a gratuitous sort of insult to a stream. You know, dump things in it. And we have pipes that belch in, whatever washes off the street. This is a continuing theme as we go down also. More capping off. This is farther on down. Plug up more sponge area, channelize the stream, put in silt. And you put up these ubiquitous signs that say, danger, keep out. And again, you see more organic, highly organic soil there that's being moved around. More fill, old concrete, old dirt, anything. Cap off the sponges. Crowd right up to the stream, as this fellow is doing. He's a little bit higher than the average, I suppose. He's about 4 feet up. It's still dangerous. You know, this is a real obscenity. You know, if you're really going to be concerned about obscenity, you ought to put people like this in jail. They're not only capping off another sponge area, but they're building houses, I suppose, that are going to, again, be 18 inches to 2 feet above the normal fall water level. You know, the water is not high. And since time immemorial, this area has served as a sponge, a sink, an overflow area for this stream. Now, the poor clowns that have houses built here are going to be in big trouble right away. And they're going to ask the rest of us to build dams, flood control works, so that that land will have some value, continued value. Now, I guess my position is that as far as society is concerned, land like that really has no value, unless there's some sort of a guarantee of a public subsidy to make it habitable. That you and I and the rest of us are going to go in and pull these people out in boats when they get flooded, or we're going to build dams and levees and all that sort of thing. Now, this is typical. This is a marsh area, fairly substantially sized. It's functioning now, but the typical thing that happens with this is that after the initial wave of people have built around it, frequently at too low levels, a period of years passes until finally somebody decides that it's economically feasible to cap it off, to drive pilings to build houses. You can see this sort of thing happening in, southwest Minneapolis. I went out and looked at some housing that was being built over an area like this. It was about $18,000 houses, actually, which were selling for about 28 to 30, in reflection of tremendous construction costs. And what the people don't know who buy them is that they're probably going to have a lot of cracked basement walls and ceilings and all that sort of thing. Okay, here's a whole area around the spongy area. Again, too low, too close. The stream just can't breathe. There's another one of these sinks of iniquity where we pour in whatever runs off the street, and there are incredibly dirty things that run off the street. Think about it for a minute. The first flush of streets is actually more yucky, if that's a descriptive enough word, than actual sewage from human beings. It's atrocious. And we build graceful structures to carry these waters under streets. We don't bother to stabilize the soil, so it runs off, and then we come out in the spring, we stick some more dirt in there, and, you know, it's a kind of a perpetual motion machine where it erodes away, and then we send crews out to put stuff in it. And, oh, man. And we try to tailor the grass right up to the edge of the water. You know, in utter stupidity, like no one in the world knew that bluegrass doesn't grow very well in water or in mud. So we have this sort of thing. The bank slumps away because the grass is poor. It isn't rooted well. It can't hold the bank. You know, and even if you didn't get your lawnmower stuck in the mud, it would be kind of stupid. And you have planners taking pictures of stupid things. Okay, this is some more sponge capping as we go on farther down. This is an area where a municipality bought parkland. You notice that they don't mow the edge of the stream. I don't know whether you know this or not, but this area has probably existed for 80 years, much like this. How long it continues to exist depends upon what happens upstream. On down a little bit farther, this was where the bad things were going to start by my original hypothesis. This is perhaps not too terribly bad. It's a pretty hard-edged stream there, but that's not necessarily bad. There's some pipes along in here that pump stuff into the stream. And as we go down farther, there are some more. There's one, there's another one. And anytime you see a 2-inch pipe running over a stream, you know that there's something pretty bad that comes out of there on occasion. But this is a really pretty area. You know, the water is rippling along, it's making noise, it's pretty, it's not dirty here. But this area is changing too. We're fairly far downstream. This man has found out that because these sponges upstream have been filled, his land is flooded now. This happens to be an industry that has been in this area for about 80 or 85 years. Never had any problem until recently. His response is to cap off some more of the sponge area with impervious material or relatively impervious material. Bad in the long term, and it's bad in the short term. Completely obliterate what was there. Leave these kind of edges. I can go back and show you little gullies in the spring again. Silt up the stream, kill fish. That's a dead fish by the rock. On the rock is silt. That's the kind of thing that happens. We go farther and we have pipes that belch more sorts of things into the stream. This is looking down. This is an area that actually used to be a lake. There are people who live and breathe in Minneapolis now who used to row and fish on this lake, once lake. This is looking out over, the stream is running along here. You can see the cathedral. Okay, this is about roughly 30 or 35 feet of fill. Again, capping off kind of situation. We're going to build on it, but we don't bother to stabilize the slope, so it's eroding away in, great gouts. Those are just weeds that are growing there accidentally. Nobody made a conscious effort to control erosion. This is the bulk of what used to be a lake. It's filled with various kinds of, I hope, inert materials. The stream runs right along through that tree line. We'll take a couple shots and you'll see what a stream that runs through one of these areas looks like. And the bank is made of broken up pavement. It's kind of incredible. But still there's character here. The water is making noise and it's moving. And it could be attractive. But we just don't use it. This is what we use the bank for. This kind of miserable kind of stuff. Again, more pipes, one there, one that actually goes down under the water, a couple that were under my feet under the water. Not very far, because the water is beginning to get pretty cloudy here. Another plant built right up on the stream, again about 30 inches above water. Absolutely no leeway for the water to rise. More development alongside. Looking downstream. Ah, yes. It's a stream that's about to pass from the mind of man. And it does, for 2.3 miles. It's had some very interesting effects. It was put underground the end of the last century. And the records of this were fairly inadequate. And people have bought land, parts of which lay over this stream, storm sewer, and have discovered that they had tremendously increased costs to put buildings on this land. They didn't even know there was a stream there. And that's the reason why you see this kind of thing where you next see it. This is about 100 yards from the Mississippi River. And that's the way it looks. And like that. And that. And there's an inch of oil and grease and stuff. And that's happened because it did pass from the mind of man. But that's not the worst thing about it, because this can be repaired. If you have the time and the money and the people, you can clean up this sort of ick. But you can't really effectively rebuild the sponges so this can function as a natural system again. You have to build structures and regulate and channel and pond and all that sort of thing, and it's not at all the same. Jumping across the river, you can see that distance pretty well mutes the agony of that particular site. I was fairly surprised. In the area of about 8 acres, I flushed out 2 pheasants and 3 rabbits. This general area. So the animals aren't terribly discouraged. I think perhaps we shouldn't be either. It can be reclaimed in terms of it could be used by the public. It's near a lot of people who really ought to have an opening to the river and be able to use this kind of thing. But again, that's not the critical thing. This is another stream in the metropolitan area. It's pretty. It's wild. But things are happening. Now, those of you who know soil and the kind of vegetation that grow on various kinds of soil, this thing screams sand. It screams erosion. It screams water pollution. These people back here are scarfing off whatever grew there originally, and we've got bare sand. We've got wind erosion at the very least. We've got water erosion, that sort of thing. And we're encroaching, sort of relentlessly creaking up on this stream. This is a stream that can still be saved fairly easily. And the sort of gratuitous dumping that occurs in areas of some primitiveness. We have a lot of streams in the area. They're about 35, roughly. Some of them big, some of them small. The whole thing really is water. It's sort of a unifying thread, if you will. And the whole question of hydrology is basic to the sort of thing that I'm talking about. The kinds of areas that we're talking about are the large water areas, lakes. There was a citizens group formed to protest the radical changing of this lake. I'm happy to say that that group has continued to be concerned with environmental problems in much the way that I've suggested to you needs to be done. We're concerned with floodplains. This area is Bayport on the St. Croix. This area, a very substantial proportion, floods. The 65 flood, virtually all of this kind of area was underwater. There's really no excuse for general urban use of all floodplains. The simple fact of the matter is that we can't build enough dams, we can't build enough levees to keep ahead of the game. I'm sorry I don't remember the precise figures, but I believe between about 1936 and 66, the Corps of Engineers spent something like $36 billion. If anyone knows that that's wrong, correct me, on flood control works. The annual damages, by contrast, from floods have increased from $500 million to $1 billion per year. Now, this is some kind of a mad hatter's dream that we're in. We're spending more money for flood control works, and we're ending up with more flood damage. It involves drainage ways. Both these smaller streams that I've mentioned, that we have a fair number of, we're actually blessed with, and the smaller kind of phantom drainage ways that run through residential neighborhoods. This happens to be vacant right now, but you'll notice that the lots around it have developed. What is going to happen is that some poor clown is going to come here in a few years, see this piece of land, buy it and build on it, and discover that he's built in the path of a local drainage system coming down that hill. It's very simple. So that's another one of the things we have to be concerned with. We have to be concerned with the use of wetlands, the existence of wetlands, and how these natural systems and drainage ways works. We must be concerned with how we use slope areas and the trees on them. Usually there are trees on steep slope areas. There are two basic problems. One is that they erode. The other is that with a particular combination of hydrology and geology, they slide down on their neighbors below, as this recent episode in California should have convinced everyone. You might say that this is the worst one in 31 years, but is that the economic life of a house? Should we build in areas like that? I think the answer has to be no. Okay, this is a look at all of the surface water in the metropolitan area, except that I missed a little bit of Upper Anoka County and a little bit of the south half of Dakota and Scott counties because of my camera. But that's what the surface water system looks like, the lakes and the streams. You add the watershed boundaries, you can see that there are really a lot of watersheds, and you get a natural system of lines that looks something like this. Pretty intricate, right? And there is not a straight line among them. They're all wiggly and crooked. What we've done in this wiggly, crooked world is added a series of right-angle lines for political jurisdictions, and not a blessed one of those corresponds with any kind of natural system. We've given far too much power in terms of control on the environment to each of these teeny little units in terms of the larger system. Even the ones that do a good job are not able to control their future because not one of them controls an entire watershed. We'll come back to this later. Can you all see all of the yellow lines? The intricate detail? I'm sorry, I have a couple other flaps combined there, one which shows slopes and the other which shows major areas of wooded cover. Okay, back to the surface water system again, streams and lakes. We had wetlands. You'll notice that there are a lot of them, a great lot of wetlands. And that pattern looks something like this. Again, there's not a straight line in the barn. They're all curvy and crooked. The darker areas on top are the wetlands associated with streams. We take the 65 flood because we don't have terribly good information on 100-year floods or maximum floods of whatever it is, the term that you're going to pick. We haven't defined these lines with mathematical precision. So this is a set of lines which shows land that was covered by the 65 flood and which may well be covered by the 69 flood. And we said, you know, it would be kind of prudent if you probably didn't build in these kind of areas until we can find out some more accurate lines. There is a policy in the Metropolitan Development Guide which says that, except for locations which have mitigating factors. Put all these together. So we have a flooded area, we have streams and rivers, and in very light gray we have these marsh areas, major marsh areas. Now this doesn't include every marsh. This is the larger ones, fairly extensive, directly associated with streams like the ones that I showed you along that stream at the beginning. Oh, this is a terrible slide. This is steep slope areas, basically areas of about 15% slope and more. You see these line up along the Minnesota River, along part of the Mississippi, and strongly along the St. Croix. They're linear just as the drainage ways and the rivers themselves are. And the concept that we have is that you sort of put all these things together and you look at them. This is about a 6 square mile area in the metropolitan area. And there's an area, these are kinds of areas in blue. This is water. The lighter blue is area that we know has been covered by floodwater, or will be. The brown, steep slope kind of areas. This tannish is a significant piece of wetland. These kind of areas here are, or these lines really, are phantom drainage ways. The balance is relatively level, somewhat sloping kind of land. Okay, you take this and you look at it and you come up with something like a development concept plan respecting these particular sets of factors. And you say something like, there's metropolitan significance in preserving the integrity of these sort of brownish kind of areas as well as the blue. These are major kind of elements that have to be controlled at greater than municipal scale. The green are connecting links between what we might say the metropolitan level part of this system and some of these aerial sites, which would include school sites, local park sites. The yellow are, well, you can see this is a major kind of freeway sort of facility. The yellow single are arterial kinds of things. The lightest area, which has these little black lines running out to it, is the most developable kind of land. And looking at it close up, this is the sort of way it looks with a slightly different exposure. You have this basic linear sort of system running up, starting from a major river, running up a stream valley, and at places penetrating up ravines, linking with a local kind of phantom drainage way that would be protected by local action. And you can see that this buildable area has the capability of putting everyone on an open space area, providing a setting for development. Really is kind of what we're talking about, different development ethic. It's really about how we all live and how it feels to live and what kind of people want to live here in the future. I suppose the most convincing thing that I could say to you, I don't know how many of you have been to Cleveland, but my life's mission is to try and avoid having the Twin Cities become like Cleveland. That's the most abysmal place in the world to try to live in. If I digress just a minute, their small streams, and they don't have very many of them, have beds that are like gray, fibrous tapioca, and just incredibly polluted. The Cuyahoga River, for about the last 2 or 3 miles, is covered with filth. You can't see water. You know, this is sort of beyond my comprehension. You can walk around in downtown Cleveland and things will fall on you out of the air and burn your skin. I stayed there for 2 weeks and left. No, that's not my world. And I just really don't want this area to become like that. I'm born and raised here, so it's extremely important to me. Okay, this is the kind of living environment that we can have. And this. We can all live in the woods. Some of you may have seen Heikki van Hartsen talk about tapiola in Finland. There's no reason why that sort of thing can't be done here. It's cheaper. It's an incredibly cheaper way to build. We've probably picked the most expensive way to build urban areas that really exist, the gridiron, the curvilinear, and that sort of thing. We have to go to clustering development and setting development within open space systems. It's not a terribly new idea. This is from Philadelphia. It's a bird's eye perspective of actually the area where Ian McHarg works. I discovered this publication after I met Ian. The Schuylkill River runs up the left side. This is the Wissahickon. And I forgot the name of Crimmins. That'll do. It's the wrong name. But anyway, Mr. McHarg lives up in this area. In plan view, it looks kind of like this. We're talking about along stream valleys, something that we refer to as protection open space. It's an area that's subject to flooding, that's subject to erosion, that's subject to slippage of structures that are built on it, that sort of thing that we feel should be regulated in the public interest. Philadelphia has done this. They have this land control. This is a piece of recreation land, lighter green. We're going to have a couple shots taken from this area, one looking out that way and one south. You can see it's in the middle of a built-up area, right? Yet this is what it looks like. This is from an upper terrace looking east. This is looking south toward downtown Philadelphia. The only thing you can see is a television tower to indicate to you that you're in the middle of a major American city. And the rest of us can have that. Now, those of you that recognize the houses that I showed you know that those came from pretty high income areas in many in the Twin Cities. Mr. McHarg is not poor anymore, as he told you this morning. And you might think that only wealthy people can afford this kind of thing. That is true, unless we take a rational overall approach to this problem. The only decent kind of environment that will remain will be that that's captured by the wealthy, relatively wealthy. We'll continue to have middle, lower class people living in ghetto type areas, less desirable environments. Nobody has yet really measured the impact on a man's soul of living on Plymouth Avenue or a place like that. But I think we know that there has to be some kind of an impact. And I think we really ought to get rid of it. It's in our power to do so. It's in our own self-interest to do so. Okay, this is a part of Philadelphia. It's far northeast Philadelphia. It was planned in the late 50s and built. You'll notice that they've incorporated the idea of preserving this stream valley, preserving this one, and of preserving this one. This is not a rich area. This housing sold in the middle half or the first half of the 60s for $11,000 to $14,000. So these are relatively modest income people who've been provided with this kind of a living environment. The city is happy, the people who live there appear to be happy, and the people who built the area made money. Pots of money, which seems to be very important. Okay, these are just a few random shots from other parts of the United States, actually, where this kind of idea has been developed, protecting stream valleys, threading them through areas, providing everyone with access to an open space system. Again, and there, around a golf course in this instance, and here. These have been built. Here's one which slides a subdivision between a freeway, buffers it well, and also preserves the river frontage. And another golf course development which preserves a stream valley. Two of them, actually. Yes, it's not a terribly new idea. I didn't tell you the whole truth. I happen to have been born and gone through about junior high school, living in this part of Minnesota. It's the southeastern part. Those of you who know it was unglaciated. Back in the 20s and the 30s, this land was flowing off to the Mississippi at a just prodigious rate. There was sheet erosion. I've seen pictures of sheet erosion that lowered the level of an individual field by as much as about 14 feet. Now, it's incredible to think about this. This land washed away. You can see pictures of fence posts way up in this field. The other field is down. There were gullies big enough to bury Cy Melby Hall in. The land was so unproductive that people abandoned farms just as they did up in the Piney Woods area. Just moved off. Abandoned them for back taxes and that kind of thing. Well, there were some people in the agricultural movement that developed an interesting kind of a concept, and that was to establish a balance between the man-made and the natural pieces of the environment, if I can paraphrase their thinking and the way they talked. That's really what they're doing. They're establishing a balance between development and non-development. Now, how this works out is that the drainage ways, the stream valleys, the steep slopes are, as a matter of fact, left relatively natural. And the farmers switched over to developing the most developable parts of the area that they happen to occupy. Where necessary, they employed things like contour plowing and strip cropping to be able to make use of some slightly marginal kind of areas with slope of such and such a degree, but not so great that they were going to get gully erosion. And what I'm suggesting really is that it worked in rural areas. It succeeded in revitalizing this part of the state, making it a productive part of this state. And I'm suggesting the transfer of this ethic and this approach to establishing a balance between urban development and the natural environment. I think it's extremely valid and a direct kind of analogy. We've worked with a citizens advisory group over the last year, a pretty good group, I think. I'm fairly pleased with the work that they've done. They didn't agree with me totally, but in many ways that was probably good. My thinking has been tempered by their thinking and their judgment. Anyway, what this group has recommended to the Metropolitan Council is that, in fact, we need state legislation to regulate the usage of these relatively intolerant kinds of areas. The areas where man will give up the most and gain the least if he builds on them. Now, this would involve defining floodplains, regulating their use. There are some kinds of uses that you can make of floodplains. I don't want to go into that because it's late. Slope areas where you'd vary structure density in inverse proportion to slope and that kind of thing. Recharge areas, as soon as we can define them well. This is a whole nother problem area. We're going to have to get water out of the ground in this metropolitan area because we're not going to have enough surface water to meet our needs as we go along. Therefore, we're going to have to make sure that we get water into the ground so that we can pull it out. Makes great sense. We're going to have to preserve wetlands so that these watersheds can function as natural systems. We're going to have to start out at the beginning